Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
It took for Marlene to cross the last 5 meters before she was standing in front of the bank building. It looked monumental, with a modern finish mixed with elaborate moldings. In addition, majestic columns in front of the entrance resembled giants. Marlene took a deep breath and climbed the steps and found herself in a luxurious and beautifully furnished space. It should be noted that she looked somewhat poor. Not like a homeless person, but not stylish either. Young security guard Kuno immediately noticed her. He stood near the cashier's desk. Out of the corner of his eye, he took note of how the young lady looked and thought that she had simply got confused and entered the wrong door. What a surprise it was for him when Marlene herself approached him. "Excuse me, can you tell me how I can get to my safe deposit box?" Only important, well-known clients usually wondered about it and asked such a type of questions. Frowning, Kuno looked her over once again and even doubted that a woman in such modest and cheap clothes could have anything stored in a box here. However, he couldn't dismiss her based solely on appearance. So, the security guard had no choice but to escort her to the bank manager. Guillermo Samaro was a stern and, at times, hot-tempered man. Greed and a passion for gambling prevailed in his character. Moreover, he often behaved uncivilized. Many people disliked him, but management valued him because Guillermo flawlessly carried out his work. At least that's how he presented it. Furthermore, he accepted assignments that made other employees' blood in their veins run cold. He would visit addresses and recover debts from delinquent borrowers, employing his own elaborate methods. That's why he was treated this way in his team. However, despite the resentment and disapproving glances, the matter remained there. Kuno led Marlene to the manager's office and cautiously said, "Here. She seems to be looking for you, Guillermo Samaro. What do you want?" The manager asked sarcastically and with mockery in his voice. "I would like to access one of the safe deposit boxes," Marlene replied uncertainly and nervously. "Strange, but I've never seen you among the clients of our bank," Guillermo remarked. "I have the key." "It's the 12th box," Marlene replied, now more calmly. The manager raised his eyebrows as he was surprised that some beggar, and that's exactly what she looked like, had come to check on a safe deposit box. "Well, let's go," he gestured, inviting her into a specially secured room. Inside, they went through several security systems. Then Guillermo checked the numbering of the boxes and was slightly taken aback. "Well, it's an old deposit box. No one has approached it for many years." It could be suggested by his tone that the manager had never seen the true owner. "It's an inheritance from my mother." "Here's my key," Marlene added. "Great," Guillermo responded. This box had indeed been rented a long time ago, or the manager knew nothing about it. He had come to work here later. Starting as a simple guard, he had worked his way up to his current position. He helped open the box, but he didn't leave the room, even though he wasn't supposed to be present. However, Guillermo disregarded this rule and stayed. Marlene carefully opened the safe deposit box. Inside there was an intricately carved jewelry box. Such boxes were usually used to store sentimental items and even precious jewels. The manager couldn't help but feel an intense desire to catch a glimpse of what was inside the jewelry box. Ignoring all the prohibitions that existed in the bank regarding this matter, he approached closer and almost knocked Marlene off her feet. "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit clumsy," Guillermo said, putting on an innocent face. "It's fine, I'm almost done." Marlene nodded and opened the jewelry box. There were gold treasures inside: earrings, rings, bracelets, chains, and necklaces. Marlene turned out to be the owner of a real treasure. Guillermo's mouth dropped open at the sight of such wealth. He barely refrained himself from whistling. Kuno, who was standing outside, couldn't see anything, so he had no idea what surprised the manager. He dutifully performed his job and didn't meddle in other people's affairs. At the same time, it was unclear where Marlene's mother could have obtained such wealth. Maria had worked as a cleaner her whole life, barely making ends meet with her daughter. They sometimes couldn't afford even the most basic things, let alone something expensive. At the bottom of the jewelry box, there was also a note, but Marlene decided to read it at home so as not to take up the bank employee's time. There was no end in manager's astonishment. Thoughts were running in his head at breakneck speed. Wow, what a pauper, a demure. But Marlene herself had no idea what awaited her in the safe deposit box. She was just as surprised as Guillermo. I should probably go, Marlene said with a trembling voice. Yes, of course, the manager nodded in response. At the same time, he had already formed a cunning plan in his mind. By the way, let the guard escort you, he suggested. There's no need to walk alone in the city with such a treasure. The guard will accompany you right to your apartment. It's a bit inconvenient. I could manage on my own, Marlene attempted to decline. But Guillermo was a persistent man. This service will be provided to you free of charge, and it will help safeguard your belongings, he insisted. Marlene agreed. After all, the jewelry box indeed contained so many precious items that it was really dangerous to walk alone with them. She agreed, and Guillermo led Marlene out of the vault and immediately called for Kuno. Escort this young lady to her home, the manager whispered in Kuno's ear, and remember her address, or better yet, write it down so you don't forget. But why are you doing this? Kuno furrowed his brows and asked. She turned out to be a VIP client of the bank, and we are responsible for her safety and comfort, Guillermo lied. I got it, boss. I'll do it right, Kuno nodded. The security guard was not accustomed to questioning orders. He had recently returned from the army and still respected ranks and titles. Guillermo was like a commanding officer to him, and, naturally, his orders were not to be questioned, only followed. Besides, it wouldn't be difficult for Kuno to accompany the young woman to her home, and it was a chance to change the scenery and take a stroll during work. Marlene was the first to leave the bank, while Kuno followed 5 minutes later. It seemed like he was receiving additional instructions from his boss. As they descended the steps, the security guard looked around before speaking. Now we can walk calmly. What the manager saw remained a mystery. As they walked, they started to talk. It turned out that Marlene was an interesting person and quite an attractive young woman. Being around her made Kuno feel as if he was reading a book in a scientific library. In turn, he shared with her how he ended up working at the bank, delving into his past. It seemed that it was not just a casual topic for him, but rather the most significant challenge he had overcome. Kuno was born and raised in a village, where he lived in a spacious house with his parents. He was an average student, not a top achiever but not a failure either, and his parents were satisfied with his grades. They believed that the education provided in the local school would be sufficient for work in the village. However, Kuno dreamed of something more. He wanted to escape from the village and move to the city. He had a girlfriend named Rebecca. They had been together since their school days and planned to build a family. However, Rebecca turned out to be deceitful and unreliable. After Kuno joined the army, she immediately found another boyfriend. Coincidentally, the son of wealthy businessmen visited their village, and they met at a party. Rebecca captivated the rich young man using her beauty and manners. He offered her to live together, and eventually, they got married. Kuno almost lost his mind and made an irreparable mistake when he learned about it. However, thanks to his commanding officer, he managed to regain control of himself. After completing his service, one of his former comrades offered him a job as a bank security guard through connections. Kuno agreed, especially since he wanted to move to the city himself. Guillermo Samaro appreciated Kuno had been serving in the army and hired him. From the first days, the young man immersed himself in the essence of the job and delivered excellent results. There hadn't been any incidents under his watch yet, which directly affected his salary. Finally, they arrived at the girl's home, and after hearing his story, Marlene said, "It's a bit sad, of course, but you did well. I've always adored guys like you." Marlene's words stirred up a storm of emotions in Kuno's soul. At the same time, a thought crossed his mind: what if I ask her out on a date? However, because he was somewhat shy, Kuno didn't dare to take the first step. Likewise, the security guard also appealed to Marlene. He seemed like a kind and honest guy to her, so as a gesture of gratitude, she invited him to drink coffee. "I bought some waffles this morning before going to the bank. Would you like to drink coffee with me?" she said. "With pleasure. Besides, it's almost time for my lunch break," Kuno nodded, entering the entrance with her. In the elevator, they went up to the 7th floor. Marlene opened the door to her apartment and let Kuno enter first. The security guard found himself in a spacious hallway. Along one wall, there was a built-in wardrobe, 2 puffs, a large mirror, and a handmade wooden coat rack a bit further away. Taking off his outerwear, Kuno walked into the bathroom. As he washed his hands there, Marlene managed to brew coffee and fill a bowl with chocolate waffles. Peeking into the kitchen, the man shook his head and said, "It's really cozy here." "I do my best," Marlene replied shyly. "Please have a seat, you've been standing at work for too long." Kuno pulled the chair closer to the table and took the coffee mug in his hands. The delightful aroma even tickled his nostrils. Noticing how he sensually inhaled the scent, Marlene couldn't resist and said, "I'm a big coffee fan. I only buy from specialized shops, choosing the roast and grind. Of course, it's not cheap, but it's worth it." Marlene waved her hand dismissively. "You surprised me," Kuno shook his head. "I didn't think such a simple-looking girl would have such a hobby." "You're embarrassing me," Marlene said, waving her hand. "It's just a regular hobby. And I'm just an ordinary girl." "Tell me something about yourself," Kuno suggested. "Where were you born, and what do you do?" "All right, why not?" Marlene agreed, taking a sip of freshly brewed coffee. In general, her fate turned out to be no better than that of a security guard. Marlene grew up in a small provincial town and had always dreamed of escaping to a big metropolis. But for a long time, it seemed like an unattainable dream. She lived with her mother, barely making ends meet on her salary alone. They were constantly short on money, and it reflected in almost everything: clothing, food, and the number of friends. Marlene had a few friends, mostly from similarly modest backgrounds. It could be said that they were united by common problems and dreams. However, the province couldn't fulfill those dreams. They had to move forward and realize their potential. Marlene often imagined how her life would go in the big city. Often, in her dreams at night, she saw a luxurious house, a long terrace, a blooming garden, and a respectable position in society. But it all disappeared as soon as Marlene woke up. She never knew her father, or maybe he didn't even exist. Her mother didn't like talking about it and found various ways to avoid answering. It seemed that it brought the sadness and pain to her heart. Maria never showed Marlene any pictures of her father or revealed any important information. From that, Marlene concluded that her mother simply didn't want to remember her father, so she didn't want to bother her with awkward questions. She excelled academically in school. Marlene was an excellent student, and teachers prepared her in advance to enter the university. After successfully passing exams and a dance competition, she became a university student. The dreams of the big city became more defined on the horizon. It seemed that there wasn't much left to reach out and touch her dreams, and her whole life could be just as she fantasized. Marlene even made a plan for how she would start conquering the metropolis. But she had to set it aside because her mother fell seriously ill. Maria went to the hospital, complaining on her headaches and fluctuating blood pressure. The doctors conducted tests and soon discovered she had an incurable disease. Marlene had to transfer to distance learning to be by her mother's side. She took charge of monitoring her mother's treatment and its effects. One day, while talking to the doctor, Marlene asked him directly, "What should we expect, doctor?" "I can't say for sure, Marlene, but we're doing everything we can," the doctor shrugged. "Are there no good medications?" Marlene asked tearfully. "My dear, if it was that simple, people would never die from diseases," the doctor sighed, patting her on the head. "The doctors did everything within their power, but they weren't wizards. Despite the timely treatment, Maria's condition worsened with each passing day. She increasingly fell into unconsciousness and could fail to recognize those around her. Marlene cared for her mother while realizing that her condition was dire. Soon, all hopes of the treatment being effective dimmed. One day, when Marlene brought chicken soup, her mother called her over and whispered softly, "I've made many mistakes in this life, but you shouldn't pay for them." "What are you talking about, Mom?" Marlene asked, leaning closer in confusion. "Don't interrupt." "It's difficult for me to speak," Maria continued. "You have a long path ahead of you, but I know you'll overcome it. And my gift will help you along the way." After that, her mother fell silent as if she had run out of words. Marlene waited for her to say what the gift was, but her mother stared at the ceiling and remained silent. Marlene didn't hear anything more from her that day. When she had the opportunity to consult with a doctor, she cautiously asked him, "What could that have meant, doctor?" "Most likely she has delusions," the doctor shrugged in response. But she spoke clearly, without any mistakes. Marlene insisted. "That sometimes happens. There are moments of clarity, and then the patient falls back into swoons," he explained. He was right, because after that day, Marlene couldn't have a normal conversation with her mother again. The woman didn't recognize her, she only shook her head and occasionally got depressed. There was nothing they could do about it, and the doctors didn't bother with unnecessary procedures. It seemed they had resigned themselves to the fact that Maria was gradually dying. They just didn't rush to inform her daughter. Maria changed right before Marlene's eyes. Her features sharpened, exposing her cheekbones and narrow chin. Slowly but surely, Marlene's mother lost her beauty and looked like an old woman. The doctors continued to fight for her life, but all their efforts were in vain. The intensified therapy and carefully selected medication, unfortunately, didn't help. Maria didn't make it until early morning. It was 3 more days before her birthday, but she joined the majority. Marlene barely coped with the loss. Family and friends supported her and helped with the funeral. During that time, she remained in a daze and couldn't believe until the end that her mother was gone. It was only after a couple of weeks that Marlene's state normalized and she began to return to reality. She had to keep living and, at the same time, address pressing matters. First and foremost, she needed to determine how to make ends meet, and she was still studying. She had 1 more year left, and Marlene had no intention of quitting her education. With difficulty, she managed to find a part-time job, although they didn't pay much, but at least it provided some income. 2 weeks later, a notary approached her and informed her that her mother had left a will. Marlene couldn't believe that her mother had prepared it in advance. At the same time, it was unclear what she had included in it. The notary answered that question by giving Marlene the number of the safe deposit box and a key. However, he didn't reveal what awaited her inside, claiming ignorance. The notary clearly knew the contents of the vault. He probably fulfilled Maria's will to surprise Marlene. She was on the verge of tears from excitement, but held back because she felt uncomfortable in front of the notary. However, the mysterious surprise turned out to appear just in time. After all, Marlene stood at a crossroads, and she urgently needed to make a decision. Her mother's will promised certain prospects. The only question was how far they could reach. Marlene didn't know that at the time, of course. However, what she discovered there completely changed her perception of her mother. It seemed she didn't know her well at all, only as much as her mother allowed. From this, it followed that her mother had something to hide all this time. "That's all my life story," Marlene shrugged and concluded. "As you can see, it's not very eventful or exciting." "My life isn't exciting either," Kuno replied. "Unless you count failed relationship, but I don't want to dwell on them anymore. It still brings sorrow and pain to my heart. I won't blame her, but I have nothing to blame myself for either. Betrayal is the worst thing a person can do." "I agree. I'm sure you'll find a good match for yourself," Marlene sympathized with him. "Thanks for the wonderful coffee, but I have to rush to work now." Kuno bid farewell to Marlene and left her apartment. Guillermo Samaro greeted him with a displeased face. What took you so long? But you yourself said she's our VIP client, and her safety is important to us. Kuno tried to justify himself to his boss. Yes, you're right. Did you write down the address as I asked? Yes, of course, here you go. The security guard handed him a piece of paper with the street name, house number, and apartment number. The bank director was satisfied and rubbed his hands, then he stared thoughtfully at one spot. Kuno couldn't help but think that Guillermo wasn't feeling good. Are you okay? He asked. Yes, everything's fine. You can go, the director nodded, finally shifting his gaze from that spot. By the way, I commend you on your efforts, and you will probably receive an award at the end of the month. Really? What for? Kuno asked in surprise. You did a good job. You ensured the safety of our wealthy client, Guillermo replied ironically and smirked. I only escorted her home, Kuno said. You see, Kuno, it's these small services that make a true security guard's job. I started my career in the same position. I did everything I could to help the director, and now I'm the director myself. Yeah, can't argue with that, Kuno nodded in agreement. Well, then, I'll return to work. There are 2 more hours until the end of my shift. Yes, go ahead. I don't need you anymore today, the boss replied and closed the door to his office. However, he didn't fully close it, and Kuno overheard something. I have an address. We should visit her in the evening. Yes, always as usual. There will be a young lady at home. She has a jewelry box. We'll take its contents and split it 50-50. It seemed that Guillermo was talking to someone on the phone, and he was so engrossed in the conversation that he simply didn't notice someone eavesdropped him. Kuno was lucky that he only lingered for a few seconds and didn't immediately go down to the customer area. The guy felt uneasy about what he had just heard. The security guard couldn't believe his ears that his boss had decided to rob Marlene. And it was all due to Kuno's compliance. Unconsciously, he had simply set up the young woman. So he needed to come up with something to leave work early. Kuno went downstairs and stayed at his workstation for a whole hour. He pondered his course of action, and when the right idea came to his mind, he went back up to his boss's office. Did you forget something? Guillermo asked. I suddenly got a stomachache, Kuno replied hesitantly. Can I go home? Strange. You were feeling good this morning, he said doubtfully. And what did you eat today? As usual, all goods were fresh, the guard mumbled, holding onto his stomach just in case. Oh, this girl treated me to coffee and waffles. Well, now it makes sense, Guillermo chuckled, naively assuming that his employee had been intoxicated. All right. Tell Emilio come to me. I'll instruct him to replace you. Okay, thanks, Kuno nodded and quickly left his office. In the customer area, he found his partner, explained the situation in a few words, and left the bank. He needed to stop by his place to arm himself and then hurry to Marlene's apartment. Kuno didn't know how many people would be there and what they would do. Perhaps they planned to simply rob Marlene by breaking into her apartment and tying her up, but things could take a different turn. Kuno couldn't allow that. The clock was ticking. Evening was approaching, and Guillermo's people could show up at Marlene's any moment now. At home, he retrieved special self-defense tools from his closet. He didn't have any weapons, and even if he did, Kuno wouldn't use them. He intended to rely on his physical strength. Prior to joining the army and during his service, Kuno had been actively involved in sports and was in excellent shape. Leaving his house, he hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address. There was heavy traffic at that time, and they were moving at a snail's pace. Kuno was noticeably nervous. He was afraid he would be late. Remembering everything Marlene had told him, he simply couldn't abandon her in such a situation, regardless of the fact that she was essentially a stranger to him. Kindness and responsibility guided his actions. So Kuno rushed to her aid, but now he had to deal with Guillermo's trusted men. He wouldn't resort to people he didn't trust, and if he made a call to someone, he was fully confident they wouldn't let him down. Lost in his thoughts, Kuno didn't notice as the taxi pulled up to Marlene's building. Paying for the ride, he got out of the car, but he didn't notice anything suspicious in the courtyard. He suddenly thought he was late, and Guillermo's men had already carried out their dark deed. However, his attention was drawn to a black SUV parked near the familiar entrance. The driver's side window was rolled down, and white smoke wafted out. It seemed someone was enjoying a harmful habit and wasn't paying attention to anything. Kuno took advantage of this oversight and stealthily approached the car. Melodic music emanated from inside. The sporty-looking driver not only smoked but also quietly hummed a tune. Smiling to himself, Kuno circumvented the vehicle, keeping low to the ground, and then sneaked into the entrance. Ignoring the elevator, he walked up to the 7th floor. It was quite there, as in the apartment. At least, no sounds were coming from inside. A strange feeling arose that the criminals had already dealt with Marlene. Without hesitating, Kuno rang the doorbell. He hoped that the thugs would answer, and he could pretend to be a neighbor. A few seconds later, someone started to open the door, and another athletic man appeared at the threshold. It seemed as if he was the driver's doppelganger or a remarkably similar person. Kuno reacted quickly and struck him twice. The man fell to the floor but managed to scream and attract attention. His partner was inside the apartment. The guard didn't hesitate and snatched Marlene from his grasp at the last moment. However, when they tried to leave, Kuno was shot in the shoulder. It was the same man whom he had struck upon entering. The guy grabbed his shoulder, enduring the excruciating pain, but didn't let go of Marlene. After a couple of minutes, they found themselves on the street, and only then did they call the police. Several cars, including an ambulance, arrived at the house. The gangsters were apprehended and taken to the station. Kuno was hospitalized, and according to the doctors, his health was not at risk. The bullet passed through and didn't affect any vital organs. Marlene, on the other hand, refused medical assistance because the criminals hadn't harmed her. Kuno had managed to protect her in time, although at the cost of his own injuries. Returning to the apartment, Marlene entered the bedroom and looked at the box on the table. First, he wanted to get rid of the inheritance from the past. After all, she had nearly died because of these treasures. At the same time, Marlene couldn't understand how her mother suddenly could possess such wealth. They had saved and lived on the edge of poverty their whole lives, yet the box with gold jewelry had been right under their noses. Marlene was overwhelmed by a strange feeling. It was as if her mother had intentionally hidden them to prevent their early use. However, this made no sense since there were times when they desperately needed money, and her mother could have sold something from those belongings, but she never did. This only fueled Marlene's suspicions further, and she even thought unwittingly that the precious items were stolen. But then, why hadn't her mother been arrested? All these thoughts swirled in her head without providing a clear and definite answer. Marlene had the impression that her mother's past was covered in fog. Living under the same roof, she had no idea what skeletons were hidden in the closet. However, her intuition told her that everything was part of a well-thought-out plan, and her mother followed each step. It just wasn't clear what Maria was striving for. If it was wealth, then she was going about it the wrong way. At least, all the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together for Marlene at this moment. Taking out the note from the bottom of the box, which she hadn't had a chance to read, Marlene unfolded the sheet of paper. Instead of the expected text, she saw only an address and a phone number. Moreover, at the very end, her mother had written, "You can always ask them for help," in her own handwriting. What could it mean? Marlene didn't know. But most likely, her mother left her a clue in this way. She needed to urgently find those who lived at the specified address. Marlene didn't want to call in advance. After all, she didn't know whose phone number it was. What if it turned out to be a surprise that she would have been recovering for a long time? No, Marlene didn't want to take that risk. She had already had enough of an encounter with the gangsters. They had terrified her greatly, almost sending her to the afterlife. Armed with a map, Marlene set off on her journey the next day. The coordinates said that the desired address was located in a neighboring region. To save time and not to go on a public transport, she decided to spend money on a private car service. Her neighbor recommended a good company that wasn't too expensive. "Just make sure to mention that you know me," Eleonora instructed Marlene. "There's a driver named Emilio, and he'll take you there." "Thank you, Eleonora." "I don't know how to thank you," Marlene replied, feeling embarrassed. "It's nothing. Just find what's so important to you," Eleonora waved her hand. Marlene didn't hide from her that she intended to uncover the threads of her mother's past and hoped to put an end to the family secrets. She spent several hours on the road, carefully observing the passing buildings, trees, and bushes. It seemed like she was memorizing the route to be able to find her way back home without any mistakes. Finally, they arrived at the right place. It was a small town, but with elite houses. Perfect cleanliness prevailed around, and for a moment, Marlene thought she had crossed the border. They passed the city limits and entered a compact village with all the benefits of civilization. It didn't boast majestic castles and palaces, but there were still richly decorated houses present. Emilio, the driver, dropped Marlene off at one such three-story mansion. "That's it, we've arrived," he said, turning to her. "Yes, thank you for the ride," Marlene nodded, expressing her gratitude for the comfortable journey. Waving goodbye to him, Marlene approached the mansion. It evoked mixed feelings in her. It felt like stepping into a fairy tale, and she expected knights to appear at any moment. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, she imagined herself as the queen of this mansion. However, she couldn't understand why her mother had given her this particular address. She looked at the extravagant structure and got to know that clearly rich people lived here. Yet, she had no connection to them. At least, her mother never mentioned them. Luxury and wealth didn't align with Marlene's past. She couldn't even recall any bright moments in their lives. But before Marlene could get any closer to the mansion, a smiling woman in her 60s approached her. She wore a beautiful and expensive dress, extending her hand for a greeting. "Good day, dear," the woman said. "My name is Dominica. I'm the owner of this house." "Hello, I'm Marlene," she replied. "But I don't know you. I was only given this address, or rather, it was indicated in a note. It was left by my mother, Maria Reyes." Marlene handed her a small piece of paper from her box. As Dominica looked at the note, her eyes widened. By the look on her face, she recognized the handwriting. Taking Marlene's hand, she led her into the house, handing her a handkerchief and wiping away her tears. Inside the mansion, Marlene saw opulent decor. She had only seen such displays of luxury on television. There was an entire art gallery, a marble floor, and antique oak furniture. It felt like a dream to Marlene, but she knew it was all real. Dominica, the homeowner, invited her to the dining table. It was also made of expensive wood and adorned with exquisite artwork. It was evident that the owners spared no expense on the furnishings, indicating their wealth and prosperity. "Please have a seat. We have much to talk about," Dominica said, gesturing to a handcrafted chair. The homeowner was soon joined by her husband, who introduced himself. "Let me introduce myself, my name is Gregorio." He said it lively, and Marlene flinched slightly when he mentioned his name. "I'm Marlene Reyes, and my mother is Maria Reyes," she repeated. "She left me this box and a note as an inheritance." Gregorio peered inside the box and then looked at his wife with fear in his eyes. "So, these are the precious items that," he whispered, barely able to catch his breath. "Yes, they are," Dominica replied with equal excitement. "Can someone explain to me what's happening here?" Marlene couldn't help but ask. Dominica poured fragrant Chinese tea and placed a bowl of sweets nearby before she started to explain. They had a business that generated considerable income. Dominica and Gregorio were fully dedicated to it, investing all their efforts and resources. Consequently, they couldn't devote enough time to raising their daughter. This led Maria to determine her own path in life. As soon as she grew a little older, she started dating a boy. Naturally, her actions didn't align with her parents' plans, and they sternly made it clear that it was too early to think about starting a family. Maria resisted their opinion and defiantly ran away from home. Perhaps she had the rebellious spirit of a teenager. At her age, many girls sought independence despite the lack of financial security and a promising future. She considered herself a bride and didn't want to listen to anything else. Her parents tried to convince her otherwise, but it was in vain. Maria distanced herself further from her parents until she completely severed all ties. And her parents couldn't bear it. They simply accepted that their daughter was lost and they needed to come to terms with it to avoid tormenting themselves with guilt. "We wanted a better future for Maria, didn't we?" Dominica lamented. "But did it turn out the opposite?" Marlene asked with a hurt tone. "Not exactly," Dominica replied, shaking her head. "With your permission, I will continue. Maria didn't have much money, so when she ran away, she took the jewelry box with her. That's where the family heirlooms were kept. However, her parents didn't pursue her or force her to come back home. They believed that their daughter should decide for herself how to live her life. One could say that Maria's parents let her go, giving her complete freedom. Maria ran away from home on emotions. She had simply fallen in love with Jose. He promised her a happy future, far away from her parents. Maria couldn't help but believe him because her fiancé came from a poor family. He had experienced all the hardships of life and was mentally prepared to overcome them. At that time, the girl had no doubts that everything would work out for them. After giving up on pursuing her, Dominica and Gregorio found solace. They realized that their daughter couldn't be stopped, and there was no point in trying to prove anything to her. Maria made her choice and thus put an end to her happy future. Life with Jose proved that he had no intention of taking any action. He was content with having his bride by his side. Soon, Jose became involved with alcohol and frequently came home intoxicated. Maria endured it for a long time, crying into her pillow at night. She hoped that Jose would change and that they would start a new life together. But with each passing day, things only got worse. He increasingly relied on the bottle, and once he even almost drank Maria's family heirlooms. Fortunately, she found out about his intentions in time and hid the jewelry box in a different place. From that moment on, their relationship completely fell apart. In the end, Jose broke up with her when she was pregnant. Maria did an ultrasound and found out that she was having a girl. After her daughter's birth, she made every effort to raise her without any assistance. It was difficult, but she never gave up. And one day, to secure Marlene's future happiness, she rented a safe deposit box and placed the jewelry box with the precious heirlooms there. Time passed, and Maria never thought of using the treasures. She thought about the jewelry box, but every time she told herself, "No, this is for Marlene." And even when she fell seriously ill, she still couldn't even bring herself to take some pieces of the precious items. Maria's courage was truly admirable. Despite knowing that there was a chance to improve her health or at least delay the inevitable end, she didn't use them. She remained silent until her last breath, refusing the chance to live a little longer. On the other hand, according to the doctors, her illness was incurable, and it was unlikely that anything could have helped. Unless a miracle occurred, but it didn't. In the end, Marlene was left without a mother. Essentially, Maria condemned herself to such an existence. It was hard to judge why she did that. She had worked as a cleaner her whole life and never touched those precious heirlooms. Marlene was shocked when Dominica told her all this. She took out her handkerchief and burst into tears. For several minutes, the girl cried and then suddenly calmed down and said, "It's hard to talk about it, but it seems you acted wisely." "What do you mean?" Gregorio asked. "You didn't force your daughter to return back home and hope that she would do it herself soon after wandering around unfamiliar places." "You're right, Marlene. That's exactly what we were counting on," Dominica nodded. "It's just terrible for us to hear that Maria is no longer with us." Getting up from her chair, Dominica walked to the window and leaned her head against it, lost in thought. Gregorio also got up and approached his wife. He embraced her shoulders and whispered, "We're not to blame for what happened. No, we are to blame. Because we didn't give her the opportunity to get married." Dominica objected. But he turned out to be an alcoholic. So what? Maybe things would have turned out differently if we had helped, his wife continued to insist. That's not true. Their family would have fallen apart anyway, Gregorio tried to convince his spouse. Maybe you're right, Dominica finally agreed. We wouldn't have been able to do anything. But now we have someone to give all our love and care for. They both looked at Marlene, and a minute later, they embraced her together. At that moment, all the sorrowful thoughts had faded into the background, and even they couldn't give everything to their daughter, now they had a granddaughter and could give it to her. Marlene also embraced her grandmother and grandfather, unable to believe in such happiness. "To be honest, I didn't expect that this is the inheritance my mother prepared for me," she said when they sat down at the table for lunch. "She knew what she was doing," Dominica replied. "What are you doing for a living?" "I'm finishing my studies at the university, and then I want to work in my field," Marlene confidently stated. "Well, it's commendable that you're thinking about the future," Gregorio said with a smile. "Do you have a boyfriend?" "Not yet, but there's someone I have my eye on," Marlene replied, squinting her right eye. "Maybe you could introduce us?" Gregorio suggested. "Oh, stop it. We've just found our granddaughter, and you immediately want to know everything about her," Dominica scolded him. "Be patient and don't pester her with questions." From that day on, Marlene's life began anew, free from problems and worries. She no longer had to count money and scrape by with random jobs. She spent a few days as a guest in their home, trying to adjust to her new life, but eventually realized that it's best to pursue her goals on her own. However, she didn't reject the support of her wealthy relatives, especially since her grandmother and grandfather were just starting to get used to her. They even asked Marlene to show them where Maria's grave was. Arriving at the cemetery, Dominica and Gregorio spent nearly half an hour by the grave. The couple stood silently, gazing at the modest monument. It was a difficult trial to endure, and they struggled to suppress the urge to break down and burst into tears right there. A day later, Marlene returned to the city to begin her search. She wanted to visit Kuno and find out how he was doing. The guard, to be honest, was surprised when she showed up. "I thought you forgot about me," Kuno said after Marlene entered the hospital room. "Why would you say that?" She replied with a smile. "I was just running errands and found my relatives. Can you imagine?" "Interesting. So you had no idea about any of this before?" he asked, surprised. "No. Mom didn't tell me anything," Marlene replied, shaking her head. "I just realized now how many secrets there were in our family." "What are you talking about?" "Well, that Mom deliberately kept the truth hidden," Marlene answered. "It turns out we were living in complete poverty while having the means to have everything we needed." "So, is all this because of the jewelry from the safe deposit box?" Kuno asked with a smile. Not only that, Marlene waved her hand in response. She briefly told him about her trip to another city and didn't hide the fact that she was deeply shocked, especially by the fact that her mother's parents didn't try to find their daughter. She understood that they had their reasons, but logically, you couldn't abandon your own child in need. Marlene believed that pride was present both from her now grandparents' side and from her late mother's side. After listening to her story, Kuno presented his arguments. "I had a similar experience in my life. I also ran away from home once and spent several days in the woods. There was a hunter's cabin, and that's where I slept. I even cooked food over a fire. It turned out that my parents knew where I was right away but didn't come to get me. They decided to give me an opportunity to test myself." "So, do you mean that my grandparents," Marlene began her question but didn't finish it. "Yes, that's right. It seems they also wanted to test your mother's strength," Kuno concluded the logical chain. "Don't hold a grudge on them. After all, you don't really know what happened in their lives when their daughter ran away from home. Just in general terms. That's what they told me. Marlene shook her head. Well, that's why I advise you to accept everything as it is, Kuno suggested, summarizing the topic. I'm sorry, I completely forgot. What did the doctors say? They said they'll discharge me soon, but I'll have to stay in bed for another week, Kuno replied cheerfully. I'll come to see you every day if you want, Marlene whispered softly and looked into his eyes intently. I do want it, Kuno agreed. Marlene took care of him, juggling her studies and trips to the hospital. The wounds turned out to be painful, and the doctors recommended that he continue to stay in the hospital. After some time, Kuno's parents arrived. They were shocked to learn that their son had been injured. Son, why have you chosen this job? His mother sighed heavily. I like it, her son replied briefly and succinctly. Dad, at least say that it's my choice. I can't disagree with your mother that you chose a risky job, his father shook his head. I always thought you'd go work as a construction worker or something. Why would you think that? What makes you think I'd be a builder? Kuno reacted unhappily. Being a security guard can earn you a decent living. All right, son, I'm sorry. Why are we even arguing? Isabella adjusted the pillow under her son and ran her hand through his hair. It was evident that she was deeply concerned. And how could she not be? After all, she and her husband had almost lost their only son. And even though he was already independent, a grown man living on his own, he was still their beloved child. Tell me, did you suffer for good? The father asked with a heavy sigh. Well, Kuno hesitated with his answer. It wasn't directly related to my duties. I don't understand. Weren't you protecting the bank's security? The mother interjected. No. I saved a girl's life, Kuno replied, shaking his head. And who is she? Lorenzo asked. You'll find out soon. Marlene should be coming any minute now. Glancing at the clock, Kuno suggested they wait a little longer. True to his words, the hospital room door opened 5 minutes later, and Marlene stepped inside. She seemed a bit flustered when she saw unfamiliar faces. I guess I'll come back another time, she said. No, you're just in time, Kuno nodded and gestured for her to take a seat. I want to introduce you to someone. This is my father, Lorenzo, and this is my mother, Isabella. Pleased to meet you, Marlene, the girl responded. Well, son, you have good taste, the father remarked, raising his eyebrows. Just like me, isn't that right, dear? Don't attention to him, Marlene. You're a beautiful girl, and Kuno is just lucky to have you. Isabella waved her hand dismissively and embraced Marlene's shoulders. It seemed as though everything had already been decided for Marlene. On the other hand, she also felt a strong attraction to Kuno. She had liked him from the moment he escorted her home. But she wanted to get to know him better. However, on that day, Kuno had rushed back to work and hadn't asked for her phone number. After meeting Kuno's parents, there was no doubt in Marlene's mind that they would become a couple. Marlene scheduled her visits during Kuno's visiting hours so they could enjoy walks in the park located on the hospital grounds. There was a beautiful pond there, and they could feed the ducks. Kuno gladly tore small pieces of bread and tossed them to the birds. They swam closer, flapping their wings, gratefully accepting the treats. They were happy together. One could say that they had found each other with loving hearts. Marlene would melt in Kuno's embrace. When he hugged her, she didn't want to think about anything else. All their problems were behind them, and no one could harm them anymore. Marlene's grandparents decided not to take the jewelry box that her mother had left her as an inheritance. They believed it was her rightful property. After some time, Marlene's wealthy relatives also arrived. They were interested in the condition she had been living in. But it turned out that they met her future fiancé instead. They were very amazed with Kuno. He made a good impression. The grandparents were astonished after having a conversation with an ordinary security guard. In their minds, he should have been someone else, but it turned out differently. Kuno had earned their trust, unlike the previous suitor of their deceased daughter. A week later, Kuno was discharged from the hospital. The doctors advised him to quit his dangerous job, but he couldn't do that because he had accepted the bank management's offer to become the head of security. Guillermo Samaro and his gang were awaiting trial and could spend the next 10 years behind bars. Moreover, no one would rehire a convicted employee who had robbed bank clients and nearly ordered someone's murder. No, the path back was definitely closed to him. After being discharged, Kuno and Marlene continued to see each other. They couldn't imagine a day without each other. It was reasonable to assume that all of this would lead to a wedding. However, the young couple didn't rush and wanted to test their feelings. Meanwhile, Marlene was finishing her studies at the university and preparing for her thesis defense. Kuno tried to help her, giving her time to relax. Soon, Marlene delighted everyone with her successful graduation and obtaining a higher education. 6 months had passed since then. Marlene's grandparents informed her that they had written a will in which they named her as the sole heir. Marlene wanted to dissuade them, but they didn't make any changes. "Look, Marlene, for us, it's like correcting past mistakes," her grandmother confessed. "But we have already resolved everything," Marlene replied, looking at her with surprise. "Perhaps, but we will never forgive ourselves, regardless. That's why we decided to seek Maria's forgiveness through you. We hope our daughter will forgive us and won't be angry," her grandmother continued. "I think this will should put an end to it," Marlene reasonably suggested. "Yes, you're right. Otherwise, we will never find peace," her grandmother nodded. And with that, they concluded their arguments about the inheritance. Remembering her daughter's unfortunate fate, Dominica and Gregorio didn't want the same future for their granddaughter and made sure everything went smoothly for Marlene and Kuno. Without being pushy, they casually helped them with money. They even paid for the wedding after Kuno proposed to Marlene. He had bought engagement rings in advance and invited her to a restaurant. As they entered, music was playing. "I'm feeling a bit nervous," Kuno said, getting down on one knee. "Please don't judge me too harshly." "I'm feeling awkward too," Marlene admitted. "Will you marry me?" He finally uttered those words. "Yes," Marlene answered loudly. At that moment, Kuno's parents and Marlene's wealthy relatives entered the restaurant. They clapped their hands and congratulated the couple. As a gift, a famous performer of popular songs appeared on stage. He took the microphone and sang in such a way that there were goosebumps on their backs. To be honest, neither Marlene nor Kuno expected this. The marriage proposal turned out to be grand and unforgettable. A month later, they also celebrated their wedding with great fanfare. It took place in the country house that Marlene's grandparents had given them as a gift. Initially, the young couple wanted to decline, but their objections were not accepted. At the wedding, Marlene's grandmother noticed that she wasn't drinking alcohol and decided to know the reason. "Granddaughter, I understand that alcohol is bad," her grandmother said, "but for your happiness, you can have a little sip." "I can't. I'm pregnant," Marlene replied with a smile on her face. "Oh my, what a wonderful gift!" Dominica exclaimed, clasping her hands together, pressing them against her face, and shedding tears. "Wait, what's going on here?" Kuno unexpectedly approached them. "I'm crying tears of joy," her grandmother replied loudly. "I'll soon have a great-granddaughter or great-grandson." "Marlene, you're pregnant?" "Yes, I took a test this morning." "I wanted to surprise you," Marlene blushed as she answered. "We have 2 things to celebrate tonight." Kuno shouted at the top of his lungs and announced that his fiancée was pregnant. Immediately, all the guests congratulated them and wished them well. The parents also joined in the congratulations. "Well done, son," Lorenzo exclaimed. "I knew everything would work out for you," Isabella said, kissing him on the cheek through tears. The wedding became the beginning of their personal happiness, which they had long sought. Kuno and Marlene found a strong family and the opportunity to become loving parents. Soon, they learned that they were expecting a son, their heir. After consulting with their families, they decided to name the boy Manuel. As for the precious items in the jewelry box, they left them for future generations. After all, the family heirlooms had allowed them to change many things, especially their outlook on life. Marlene and Kuno realized that nothing was more valuable than love, and they had no temptation to convert the treasures into money. Gradually, they furnished their home and prepared a spacious room for their son. His birth and upbringing in the near future became their top priority.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like